I think one of my favorite things to quote is you can apply this to anything, which is cut it in half and then cut it in half again.
In case you didn't know, we're relaunching the course that started it all, Animation Bootcamp. And to celebrate the new version of the class, we enlisted our friends at Ordinary Folk to design a killer set of boards for the course's final project. In this interview, I chat with Jorge and Avi from Ordinary Folk about the design of this project. And we go pretty deep into the weeds about how they manage client projects, how their design process works. This is a fun one, so let's jump right in. Hey, and Avi, it's so nice to have you both on. Thank you for coming on and chatting about this incredible project that you helped us out with.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing us into the project. It's always fun.
Well, I love getting the band back together. You know, we've jammed a bunch of times now in the past. And actually, Jorge, you know, one of the reasons that I thought it would be cool to work with Ordinary Folk on this was because this is for the rebooting of Animation Bootcamp. And you were actually the first interview that I did for the original course when you were back at Giant Ant. So I felt like this is nice. It comes full circle. You know, it's the circle of life.
Yeah, it's been a long time. That was feels like a lifetime ago.
Yeah, I don't want to do public math, but it was many years ago. So, Avi, I want to start by talking to you about your background a little bit. So, you know, we're going to be showing off the Styleframes that you did for this project. And they're very abstract and stylized the way a lot of motion design things are. But I was trying to do my Google stalking on you, and it was very difficult. You don't really have much of an internet presence like most of the people I talk to do. But I did find your Instagram, and you had, you know, there's like some images that you did on there, some, I assume, digital paintings. And so it's clear to me that you have an art background, or at least you've been doing this a while. You really know what you're doing. And so I'm always curious when I meet artists that are really good at sort of traditional art, you know, like portraits and illustration and painting and things like that, but then end up working in this really abstract world of motion design where you're not thinking as literally sometimes as you do in the traditional art world. So I'm curious how your background sort of informs what you're doing now at Ordinary Folk.
Yeah, I actually don't really have much of a background in design at all. My formal training is in nursing. And I did that for many years and then transitioned. But drawing and painting is just something I've grown up doing a lot and spent so much time just enjoying, like, learning how light works. And yeah, I think growing up especially, I just really loved realism. And so studying those things gave me a lot of joy. And so I guess through just courses and practice, I kind of like developed that sort of a style. But I've really loved coming to Ordinary Folk and just falling in love with abstract design and just how it's kind of in many ways coming to the core of like what makes something beautiful. I think like most complex art pieces can always be simplified down to maybe like 3 or 4 very simple shapes. And those simple shapes are kind of like why something works or doesn't work, at least from like a compositional standpoint. So yeah, it's been like a fun balance. I think it's made me better at like more complex, like realism than maybe the other way around. But yeah.
Cool. Well, now I have to ask, how did you get from nursing and what, like, did you go to nursing school? Like, how did you get from that to what you're doing now?
Yeah, it was a big change. Yeah, I studied nursing and international studies actually, and then worked for 4 years as an emergency room nurse. And I just didn't love it. I think I just always in the back of my mind had art on my brain and wanted to try it. And so I just started studying on my own time. Just more intentionally and looking for different avenues to take to come into like a design or art space, whatever that could be, and started to apply to different animation studios, and Ordinary Folk got back to me. And so I started here as an intern in November of 2020, I think.
Wow.
Didn't you also take a school motion something?
Yeah. I took Sarah Beth's course and then I think like an intro, like a very intro class, not yours, Joey, but
Sarah Beth's course is amazing. That's really, I bet you love that one. Yeah, given your background. So, okay, well, this is great. So this leads into another question I had, but it makes it even more intriguing to me. So Jorge, I mean, you know, when you put out the call, hey, we're looking for interns or we're looking for designers, I'm sure you must get swamped. And, you know, Avi doesn't have the traditional background I would assume most people that apply to Ordinary Folk would have, right? Like maybe going to art school and maybe having some experience in the motion design field. But Avi, coming from this completely separate world, but sort of being, I guess, like a natural artist, what did you see that made you think, I think this person might actually be a good fit here and might have some talent that we can use?
Yeah, that's a great question. But I think like a lot of it is, well, first of all, I wouldn't say that we get like an overwhelming amount of applications for internships. Like I think it's, like I wouldn't say it's like ridiculous. Like it's pretty normal, I would say. And the other thing is like for various reasons, we try to limit it to Canadian people that can be in the studio and that can work legally in Canada. So there's a few like limitations that we know that like maybe for someone who's like, I don't know, in the US, getting them a visa here just for an internship, it might not be something that we can just kind of work through just for an internship because we're not the size of, I don't know, Buck or the big ones. So that's one of the things. So anytime we get a Canadian intern application, it's always like, oh, they're in Canada. Like they're already like halfway there for what we need. And the other thing is like I've always, even since the start of Near Folk, that I want to make sure that we had an internship program. Meaning that we at least have 2 people a year always coming in and out of the doors through the studio. So it's always like, even though we get applications, we actually also try to look for them. 2 of our interns from this year, we actually found them instead of them found us. And in the past, it's been usually other people found us. So in the case of Abby, she found us, she emailed us, and she already had quite a bit of work. Well, she had some work in your Instagram, and then you share some of the work that she had done. And there was something, I don't want to say it, but there's a taste thing that you can tell immediately when you see someone's work, even if the work is not quite there yet, or you can see like, okay, they're just starting. You can tell that they're trying something new, that they're trying to push something, they're trying new techniques, there's certain interesting compositions or ways of thinking about concepts that it just feels a bit less than what everyone else is doing. So pretty much with every intern that we've had, we've always noticed that. And with Abby, that became pretty obvious. And we're like, well, let's just hop on a call with her and see what's it about. And then I think the whole team was there and we're like asking her questions. And then she was very quiet and unassuming. Very nervous. And then we're like, she seems great. Let's just do it. And then it was pretty quickly that we realized that she had some untapped talents, which pretty much whenever we find that with interns, we try to keep them around. And that's happened with Abby, that's happened with Mona, who's lurking here in the background. And that happened with JP, although he's not with us anymore. He's still alive, just not with us. No. So I think it was like you can just tell that there's a certain taste, and it's kind of hard to pinpoint. But whenever you see a portfolio that everything in their portfolio, even if it's whatever, only 9 images, that 8 of them feel like they're just trying to do what everyone else is doing. Oh, there's it doesn't feel like it quite has a voice. Like I'd rather see something that is half baked, but it has a unique voice, especially when it comes to interns. That's something fully polished that looks just like Sarah Beth's, if that makes sense.
Right. That makes sense. Plus, I guess the bonus is that if you need an IV or something, Avi can probably she probably find a vein pretty quick. Yeah.
Yeah, it was after COVID. We're like, maybe we should get a nurse.
We need a nurse. Okay, well, that's really fascinating to me. So, Avi, I'm gonna ask you this first. Like, and it's an interesting question, and I've asked a lot of people this question. I get different answers. I'm curious what your take is. That elusive taste that everyone who hires artists is after. Where did that come from for you? Were you aware you had taste, or were you surprised when Jorge and the team said, we actually want you to come work for us because we think you have good taste? Like, did you try and study to develop that, or have you always just sort of had this sensibility?
Yeah, no, I think I was surprised. I don't think it's something I've intentionally tried to build. I think I like looking at art and studying art in kind of like all its different forms and in many different places. So maybe that's helped. But yeah, otherwise I'm not too sure.
Interesting. All right. So Jorge, from your perspective, having worked with lots and lots of artists and hired now many artists, where do you think it comes from? Is there some part of it that's just innate? Some people just are born with good taste, or is there a certain amount of work someone can put in to develop their taste?
It's a contentious answer, Joey.
Yeah, I know. Let's get canceled. Come on, let's do it.
Let me. I think like I'll turn it around to like it's a bit different when it comes to art. So I'm gonna try to answer it by going around it and trying to come back to the answer. It was like when I ask you what kind of music do you like, or when I ask you what kind of food you like, you don't think, oh, your immediate response is not like, oh, where I developed it. It's more like when I discovered it for the first time. Mm-hmm. It's like once you heard that music, once you've tasted that food, it's like, oh man, I love this. Like there's not like a big training that you had, or like there's just an innate response. And I feel like that kind of taste, I do think that you're born with it, and people will have different tastes in different things and different sensitivities to different things. Like, I'm not going to pretend I know what kind of coffee Victor makes that is 10 times better than the other one, because I just don't have that palate. Like I literally don't have the physical sensibility in my palate to taste the differences in certain things. And I think when it comes to art, it can be similar. Like I think a lot of people will just have that taste. Like there will be certain things that they're attracted to that others might not, or there will be a certain parts of a certain painting that they'll notice and others not. And I don't necessarily think that that's, like, I think that's something that you should evolve if you have it. But the very starting point, I think, as rude as it might sound, I think you either have it or you don't. And I have to say, like, as a caveat, like the other day we were talking about this, and it sounded kind of mean. But I also think, like, if you are into this field, there was something that caught your attention, right? Like there was some kind of taste somewhere that you were like, oh, I want to learn how to do that, because it was something that attracted to you that. So maybe I don't want to make this very general, because I don't think everyone in this field has that amazing taste. But I think if, like, going back to what brought you into this field, and that is the indicative that you have an eye for something that is unique or different, or it's something that really attracted you to get into this field. So I think, I'm answering yes to both. I think you do kind of have like an innate talent, if you will, that just gravitates you toward this kind of art. And as you develop that, then you can develop your taste. But I do think that you need kind of like that base starting point that you can become better at discerning what it is that you like, or what are the details that you like, or what is it about this painting or this animation or what this illustration that makes it unique and special. And you can develop your eye that way, the same way that maybe you can develop your palate or whatever. But initially, the gut reaction, you either had it or you didn't.
Right. That's interesting. All right. We're going to have to check the YouTube comments and see if people agree with you or disagree. So, Avi, coming from, sort of it sounds like a more traditional love of art and not even so much design, but just sort of traditional art. How difficult was it for you to come in and wrap your head around doing, I guess there's two parts. One is more abstract design, which you touched on a little bit. But then the second part is you're designing things that will eventually move. And you're telling stories that are not just like this one image that tells the story. It might be, in the case of the boards you did for us, 18 or 20 images. And they have to go together and work as a whole. What was the learning curve like for you to do that?
Yeah, it was a big learning curve. I think like Grace Pearson, Jorge, and the team have been very patient as I've learned so much and just practiced. But I think motion is just so exciting because we get to plan out really big pieces, or even just like, 5 frames. Like it's a very different way of thinking than just designing one frame. And I really love that. It's very, very fun. Yeah, I think it's especially cool because everything becomes like very contextual. And so every frame that you're designing is impacting what comes before it and what comes after it. And so you get to just build with momentum in a way that you can't really do in a single frame. So I just love thinking about it. It's really fun.
I love that, actually. Build with momentum. It's a really good way of putting it. Jorge, from your perspective, is it easier to take somebody like Avi who has good taste and has some artistic skill already and then teach them about animation? Or is it easier to find someone who already understands animation and can use After Effects and teach them to have good taste in design? And this is kind of a softball question given what you just said, but I kind of want to hear how you think about it. You know, taking someone with a nursing background who's I assume never done animation, and now she's doing boards for like an animation class, and they came out amazing.
Yeah, I mean, the way you phrase that question, is it easier? Like, I think it's definitely easier to work with someone who has the background because, it might just make things smoother. Is it better? I 100% say no. Like, I almost, like, even when I was at Giant Ant, like when we found Raphael, when we found Eric, they hadn't done anything with motion. Like, they knew it existed and maybe they like develop a few things, but it was just like, they have amazing illustrations. They have a great sense of taste. They clearly have like skills and in the softwares that they use. Let's just teach them how to do motion. It's like, hey, you made one frame. Now you're going to make 20 of that same style and then tell a story with it. And I felt like that's a lot of the times, like some of the best designers that I've met kind of didn't necessarily have a motion background. And they were like just focused on design and illustration. And then I find when they are brought into motion, that if they like it, some people might not, but if they like it, then like all that knowledge that they had that they can apply to one frame, it just gets exponentially better when they apply it to a whole story. And it's, in some ways it yields better and more unexpected results that someone who knows exactly how it's going to move, might board something. So in some ways I actually prefer it when there's not that much in knowledge of the motion process, because you can learn that pretty quickly, and then we'll figure it out. Like we have a huge team of, well, I won't say huge team. We have a big team of animators here that will be willing to kind of try any transition that comes out of your brain, and that's kind of like the cool moments for animators when they see a transition or a frame or a sequence, and we're like, I have no idea how we're gonna do this. And I feel like those moments usually come from people like Avi that might not know how it's going to get animated technically,
right?
But they can see it and they can envision it, and it was like, okay, here, have fun. The same way that the animators are like, they might not be able to design what Avi designs, and they're like, you do your thing, and then we'll do our thing, and then hopefully the result will be something that neither of us could have done on our own.
Yeah. I if I recall correctly, Jorge, I'm pretty sure we even talked about this exact thing in the interview that we did, years ago for the original version of this class. And it's this idea that sometimes as an animator, you hamstring yourself when you're designing because you know how hard it's going to be and how much work it's going to take. But the designer may not know because they're not an animator, or they just may not care because they're not the one animating. And so the result's the same. You're going to get something more complex and more nuanced and maybe more creative. I think that's a really cool idea. So why don't we jump in and actually talk about this project and go through some of the iterations of it. So why don't we really quickly just listen to the voiceover and hear the script, which you guys also helped write, and then we can kind of dive in and talk about it.
Consider the master ice sculptor. Is the newness of the chainsaw his greatest concern? How it sparkles and impresses the crowd? No, his concerns are of a higher order. To craft. The icy Excalibur shapes, cuts, chisels, and sizzles away to reveal a majestic robot, a golden bobsled, or a tiny T-Rex from a simple block of ice. The tool is but the gateway to imagination, an instrument for an icy symphony. Without the craft, the tool is nothing.
All right, so Avi, we end up with this script, and there's kind of this tone to it, and I think on top of having to figure out like what you're actually going to show for each line of the script and each shot, you also had this weird requirement that you probably don't normally have, which is that the people animating this are not going to be artists with decades of experience, and you kind of have to make it fit within a certain time limit, to be animated. So there was also sort of an art direction, requirement as far as how complicated it could be. So I'd love to hear how you sort of begin the process like this. You've got this script and you have a bunch of empty white frames. And what do you do? How do you get from that to this idea and this sort of style that you sketched out initially?
Yeah. Well, we started a few different places. I suppose the key one is the script right away and just identifying the tone of it. And I mean, of course, it just has this really fun energy and humor to it. And so we started looking for references. I think several different people on our team actually gathering references and trying to find something shape-wise and also color-wise that just matched that tone. Whether it was like specific patterns or I know Illo has some great like simple color movement combinations, and I don't know, just different places that we could find that would inspire something that would have that level of simplicity but also be in keeping with the tone of the piece. And then usually from there, I spend like at least a day when we have time just exploring sketches really loosely and like with as much freedom as possible, just exploring and trying different things. And those are usually then like within those sketches, however many get done, usually within that we like grab pieces that we feel like are actually hitting the right note, and use those and match them with the script, and start building from there.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit about this process because I've seen this process up close many, many times, but every artist, every studio does it slightly differently. And I thought it was really interesting. So, for everyone watching, the brief was essentially that this is an animation class. The students taking it are going to have a wide range of skills, but we can't assume that they know 3D or can do cell animation or know expressions. That we assume sort of a basic level of After Effects knowledge, but the animation is really the hero here. And so the idea was, let's create a simplified design, something kind of abstract. And so where we ended up is this very geometric place. But in this first pass of illustrations, you showed some alternate examples where things were a little rounder and maybe there was a little bit more detail. And I'm curious, sort of how you approach showing clients variety. Like, were you just kind of having ideas and unsure about what is going to work? Or were you thinking, nah, I'm pretty sure the geometric thing's what I want, but I'm going to show them an option just so they can feel like they got to pick? Like, I'm curious, like how you sort of approach showing variety in this early stage when it's going to drastically affect where you end up.
Yeah, I think we're usually pretty careful about showing variety, and we'll show things that we're excited about. And I still really like some of those initial explorations that we showed. A few of those are graces as well. And yeah, I think ultimately we ended up leaning more towards the geometric just because of the freedom that we could have for modularity, for building out the different ice sculptures. But I think it's always just good to present options because then you also get more of a feel for what a client is looking for, instead of maybe just dictating something that doesn't quite line up.
Yeah, I remember seeing these and thinking that they were so cool, but I was also trying to imagine the extra complexity that comes in, having to line up shapes with curves versus straight edges and stuff like that. And, it's kind of a really weird thing to design something that, a student's going to be animating and trying to calibrate for that. And I think you did a brilliant job. So, go ahead, Jorge.
I was just going to add, I think like one of the things we do, especially with clients that we don't know, it's a bit different with you guys. We felt more comfortable sharing explorations because, we know you, there's a bit of a relationship. But when it comes to client projects, and I think going back a little bit to the taste conversation, we actually don't know what their taste is. And a lot of the feedback will come strictly from their taste. And they might be totally distanced from any kind of creative field, but they still have certain kind of taste and they kind of know their brand. So a lot of the times and especially that first round of just putting visuals, because up to this point, they've all seen words. the first time that we put visuals on them, it is really in a way to define the goalposts of kind of where their taste is at, or how they're comfortable with like level of abstraction, or like they maybe want something more literal. Because a lot of these things you might be able to talk about, but it's not until you actually hear from them that you'll get a real reaction of what they thought they wanted, but then once they saw it, maybe that's not the right thing. So a lot of it is kind of like developing, kind of like we're just throwing stuff at them, hoping that we can define certain guidelines or boundaries, so that the next round we can kind of like, okay, they responded pretty well to this, and then we can kind of read it between the lines here. It was like, oh, this lines up with a certain thing they had in their brand, so they're leaning kind of more towards abstract, or like, oh, I was not expecting they would be okay with this different approach, but they seem very comfortable with it, which is great. I'm glad we share that instead of just playing it safe and then do that. And sometimes it's the opposite. It was like, oh, this is way too crazy and you got to scale back and stuff. And that like we rather know that on our first visual delivery, because that will dictate the relationship from then on. So that's a big reason why we do that as well.
Yeah. So one of the things that struck me looking back at this, sort of preparing to talk to you both, was how closely this turned into the actual boards. I mean, some of the compositions seem basically identical. So I'm curious, Avi, this is kind of a geeky question, but like technically, how did you draw these? Did you do these in Photoshop or Illustrator or Procreate? Like, how did you actually make these frames?
Yeah, they're sketched in Procreate. I started drawing in Procreate, so it's always just the most comfortable place for me to draw, and I don't like to be thinking too much when I'm concepting, so I always sketch there. So yeah, I think maybe like one of the first frames that I thought was working was maybe SO401. And so some of those ones were just the ones, like that one just felt right from kind of the massive initial sketches. So I feel like that was kind of one of the ones that I pulled and then started to just match to that, and a few of the other ones that felt that way also.
And, as someone who doesn't have a deep animation background, how are you checking in to make sure that these designs would sort of fit the animation requirements? Were you checking with your colleagues at OF? Were you making sure okay, this is kind of easy to animate, or is this too hard? Like, how did that process work?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of it's probably too hard for me to animate, but
I got a good class for you, Avi. So I know a guy.
I was checking in with the animators in the studio and getting their opinions and their thoughts, and I think sending you questions as well, just to check in to make sure that we're hitting something that's really, really fun, but still like very much achievable.
That's awesome. So you said something that I want to ask you about. You said, I don't like to think too much when I'm in the concepting phase. And I had a question in here about, how is your process different when you're in this phase versus when you're in the actual designing Styleframes phase? And there's always this kind of funneling of ideas. You start out really general and it gets more and more specific as you get into animation. I'm curious, how you sort of think about that, and does it feel different to be doing stuff in Procreate with a pencil, or a pencil, like a digital pencil, versus in Illustrator being more precise? Is there some like mental difference for you?
I think so. I think I'm working towards feeling really like free in all different programs, but right now Procreate just is the most free in terms of concepting. Yeah, like I definitely like to not think and just try and play as much as possible to find really interesting ideas. And sometimes you can tell when it feels forced. And I don't know, some days are just good and some days aren't as far as coming up with ideas. But yeah, and then I think I just think about different things when I'm actually designing. Like when I'm actually designing, I'm thinking more about whether it's reading, whether my level of importance for different things within the frame are as they should be. I think I just start asking myself different questions when I'm starting to build something that needs to be really cohesive across the board.
Cool. So I'm curious if you maybe can try to describe, what is it like in your head when you are looking at a line like the icy Excalibur shapes, cuts, chisels, and sizzles away to reveal, and you know that there's nothing like concrete and specific that has to be shown there. There's sort of this implication of, cutting with a chainsaw and there's ice, but there's not like it's not like storyboarding a movie, right? Where you're like, okay, medium shot of a lumberjack holding a chainsaw. So in your head, when you're doing this, like, how are you envisioning these things and coming up with these ideas in the first place?
Yeah, I think especially with things that are more abstract, I am honing in on like the feeling of what we're trying to communicate. And it kind of comes back to that, I suppose, that comment I made earlier about like building with momentum, like where is it in the sequence? And so like the line that you just read is a really big moment leading into all the different things that can be crafted with the chainsaw. And so I think I was just thinking about something that can be really like this dramatic and exciting transition that begins then all the rearrangements of shapes. And so having a chainsaw just like slice through pillars of ice and having all like the different shards there as pieces that are ready to be rearranged ended up working well and like fitting that feeling that I was going for.
Mm-hmm. And I want to ask you about abstraction too. This is something that I've always kind of been fascinated by. And, like I'm not a natural designer at all. And so it's always fascinating to me when I meet people who just sort of have the talent for it. And I know that it takes a lot of hard work, but one of the things that I've never quite been able to wrap my head around is how some people are so good at taking something super complicated. Like a chainsaw is not a simple looking thing. There's a million parts to it. But the design that you ended up with, so this is a good frame right here to look at it. It's composed. It's almost like the toy that you get when you're 4 years old and it's just a bunch of wooden blocks and you can make different shapes out of it. And you know that that's a chainsaw. How did you come up with this design? Like, how do you approach taking something? And there's a lot of examples in this. There's a robot, there's a dinosaur, and there's a bobsled, and all of them are very abstract and very simplified. How do you approach that? Is that something you've developed by looking at other art where that's a thing, or do you have an intuition for it?
Maybe an intuition, but also I think just a lot of iteration and a lot of like trial and error to try and find out how little you can add to something where it's still readable. And so, yeah, I think we tried a few different. I definitely tried many different chainsaws to try and find something that would fit and then fit with what we wanted to do with like the modularity of the ice sculptures.
Yeah, I wanted to pull this up because you're making me think of, like I remember the first time I saw this picture, right? You've seen this before, right? The Picasso bull abstraction. Yeah. Like I remember seeing that, I don't know, probably in high school or something like that and thinking, how did he know to do that? That's crazy. And I think that's one of the things I actually love about motion design is that you're called on to do this constantly. That's kind of, as someone designing for motion design, I feel like that's half the battle is how do you say something really complicated in the simplest way sometimes. So I just thought that's cool. So, okay, so how many iterations of that chainsaw do you think you went through? And even if it was just iterations you didn't show anybody else, just you were looking at them?
That's a good question. I don't know, maybe 20-ish?
Oh, wow. Okay.
Or
that's cool. That makes me feel better.
I think one of my favorite things to quote is, you might have been there, Joey, when Erica was giving her talk at Blend. Mm-hmm. And I quote this all the time, every time I can. I'll probably quoted it to you. Whereas you can apply this to anything, which is cut it in half and then cut it in half again. We do that for scripts all the time because half the time you don't need half the words that is there. Mm-hmm. And I think when it comes to abstraction, in many ways, that principle is very present in your mind. Like you'll start and then you're like, oh, maybe I don't need a square here. I was like, oh, like you kind of start simplifying by removing elements as you go by. To answer just what I was asking, how little can you get away with to get the idea across?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost like that principle of negative space in design. And it's uncomfortable, especially when you learn to design, to leave things empty. but it makes it stronger when you do that. Before we continue this interview, I'd like to tell you about the new and improved Animation Bootcamp. See, this is the course that I wished had existed when I was starting out. It focuses entirely on the principles of good animation, and specifically how to apply those principles in After Effects. You'll learn to absolutely make sweet love to the graph editor, and you'll even pick up some more advanced strategies later in the course to help you choreograph complex animations with lots of layers. And as with all of our guided courses, you'll be learning alongside hundreds of other motion designers on the same journey as you. And you'll be getting support and feedback on all of your work from your own personal teaching assistant. Check it out. The details are in the description. You guys just did a piece. It was with cubes. It was kind of monochromatic. That was very minimal. I mean, it was almost terrifying how little was like on screen at certain times, you know? And I think that's like some of the best pieces, you know, you think back to like some of the Apple stuff that Buck's done where it's so simple. And you know there must have been pitches that were just wild. And then someone said, cut it in half. But not again, do it 10 more times. Cut it in half 10 more times. And yeah, now we're there. Now we're where it should be. So this is a minor version of that. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, you have no idea how many versions it took us to get to those cubes, man.
Yeah.
Avi, I don't know how many versions. The color especially. Woo.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an amazing piece. All right, so now, Avi, I want to talk about the actual style frames and something that, you know, it's funny, like when we got on the initial discovery call with you guys, we were looking at the original frames. We were showing the original style frames that I did way back in the day when I didn't realize a lot of people would take this class, frankly. And some of them, they're so bad. It's like embarrassing to look back at them. But so it should be obvious that I'm not a trained designer. I didn't go to art school, and it's not really my strong suit. But one of the things I've always struggled with, and I've really just tried very hard to get better at, is color. And so when I look at my screen right now with all of these boards on it, it's not just that the colors that were chosen are nice, and I know that they seem somewhat, you know, inspired by our logo colors, right, in our brand, but the way they're put next to each other, just the way that they're balanced and the light and the dark values kind of work together. That is so hard for me to do. So Avi, I'm curious how you approach using color and maybe just kind of take us through the process of how you approached it for this project. I mean, and maybe we could even look at a frame, I don't know, like maybe this is a good one here, right? This has basically every color that's present in this piece is on this frame somewhere with overlapping shapes, and somehow you're not getting that buzzing effect that can happen when you have two very saturated colors next to each other. So how do you control that? How do you decide what goes where and how the colors are going to work?
Yeah, I find like color scripts really, really helpful to try and solve a lot of those problems before getting to the actual style frame. And you just learn a lot of things when you put the colors side by side. For example, like the teal and the pink buzz for sure when they're like on top of each other. And the blue is like really, really helpful in neutralizing a lot of the saturation of like the yellow and the teal. And so I think it was just trying a lot. I feel like I sound like a broken record because it was just like iterating and seeing what works and when the colors like together really sing. I feel like I'm always trying to like find that, and you know it when you hit it. And so I think, yeah, just exploring. And we also wanted like the overlaps to be used really intentionally as far as making sure that the color of like having so many of them there coming together are for like our biggest moments of like the ice sculptor is creating something and like that creative spark is there. So that's specific to this frame as well.
I feel like Abby's underselling a little bit the process here. I think one thing that you're very good at is feeling the flow of the color, if that makes sense. Like when you have the color script, you can see all like zoom out, big picture. Like you're just like smooshing colors over the storyboard, right? Like that's just your color script. You're not really thinking too much about style or specific things. You're just following the color. And I think one of the many strengths of Abby is that she can look at it and pinpoint, might not be able to pinpoint the solution, but pinpoint where it feels off. Like whenever Abby comes over and she says like, there's something that feels off with this frame, it was like, okay, we got to focus on this because She kind of had like this trained color flow that I absolutely do not have. And she can like, okay, there's just something off about this, but if we change this, then it's going to have a trickle effect that is going to affect the next frame. So let's focus on this, see how it works, and then try a few variations. So it's not just trying things randomly, it's like trying how it affects the rest. It's like, okay, well, what if we change the background of shot 3 to yellow? That means that the next shot can't be yellow, and it also can't be, I don't know, one of the other colors that might not work well. So what are the repercussions of all this? So like, I feel like that trial error is very much intentional, and like you try one thing, see what other repercussions of that is, may not work. You go back, try it with a different color of the defined palette that you have. And worst case scenario is like, hey, we do need to change the palette slightly to make it work, and then you do that. So it's a lot of it like you're testing things, see how it fits, and then adjusting accordingly.
They're big puzzles.
Yeah.
Love it. So Avi, when you say color script, what do you mean exactly?
Yeah, I mean like a color rough of taking all the sketches and usually putting them into one document, and then just taking colors that we want to try and seeing how it flows all the way through, really roughly.
Is it basically like the sketches, and you just put like a wash of color over it, or are you starting to actually pick colors for things?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember in this case specifically what we did. I think we might have done it as we were building. So, but yeah, typically it's like just very rough. So it could just be washed color over top of the sketches.
Interesting. Now, one of the things that now I will say in my defense, I have become a better designer and I've gotten a better eye since those early days. But one of the way that I tend to get better at design is, I think, fairly mechanical compared to the way I see a lot of designers operate. So I really like when there's a rule I can follow. So I actually loved learning about color theory and value structure and complementary versus triad, split complementary, all these things, spot color, because it gave me like a rule of thumb I could follow and sort of a starting point. Because I find my intuitions for color lead me astray sometimes, and I don't trust them. So I kind of like to have those rules. And I'm curious if in your early art background, you encountered those things, and do you use any of that stuff? Or is color more of like, you kind of said, it's good when you see it. You can kind of tell when it's there.
Yeah, I think it's a combination. I really love like color classes and learning more about the principles of them. But I think usually when I actually start refining things, I'm refining it more to how I feel it should be, and to like things that stand out to me as I'm building. Like for example, maybe like I'll be putting colors down and see that like two of them are really like working nicely together and getting to the feeling that I'm hoping for, and so then I'll just lean into that more. I know that's kind of like not a super specific answer, but I think it's maybe a little bit half and half. It's really helpful to know the principles, but then at some point you want to like depart from them and go by feel.
I'd like to, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about maybe talk a little bit about how you're working in Illustrator too, because I see, a lot of people do boards in different ways. And one of the things that's been cool is I've seen more and more artists working this way, not just in Illustrator, but also in Photoshop, where all of the boards are visible at all times. And I think there's some obvious reasons to do that and some obvious benefits, but I'm curious if you could talk about why you work this way versus just sort of one frame at a time and really focusing on that one frame.
Yeah, when I was actually building these, and with Grace and a few other people's help also, I did have them separated out as like individual files just because it was easier to like version up and work through different ideas. But that said, like there's always a document where I have all of them in one place so that I can see how they're working together. Yeah, and I think that it just is helpful to make sure that you always have like one eye on the bigger picture of how they're interacting with each other.
And when you're looking at it in that way, what are the things that you sort of look for? I mean, are you looking for like, oh, we have too many wide shots in a row, or there's too much blue in a row? Like what are the kind of things that jump out at you when you look at it in this view?
Yeah, definitely like the balance of color. So like I don't want to have like, I don't know, half of these frames be blue certainly, like a nice balance of them. But one thing I do with projects as well is make sure that I have like an emotion to time chart so that I know where my big moments are and are calling those out, and that I'm building into them, and that I know where like the troughs and the normals are, so that everything is hopefully in some way like moving the story forward. And so, yeah, I definitely have that in mind as well when I'm looking at the big picture.
Awesome. I wanted to just kind of zoom in and look at some of these because I think these are so fun. Where did the idea come from to build everything out of these simple shapes? I mean, it's one of those things where once you said it, I was like, oh, that's such an obviously good idea, but like, where did that come from?
Yeah, I think just like the desire to make sure that animators are having fun, but not having to worry too much about design. And so by building them with really simple shapes, they can hopefully like rearrange things like quite nicely, but also do their own building if they chose that, and be able to construct for themselves, but make sure that it would still fit within the style. So I think, yeah, just giving as much freedom and creative possibility to the animators was kind of the main thought behind that.
And I think it was in one of our early conversations that is also mentioned the idea of, I don't know who it came from, but it might have been you, Joey. But like the idea of like maybe trying something modular. And immediately our brains kind of went to like those little pieces of abstract shape that you can make a duck or a dinosaur and things like that. With the same amount of pieces that you have, you can create. And it like that idea of modularity, it was kind of like a bit of inspiration, quite a bit of inspiration for the whole piece. So it was kind of like this big thought that was discovered, say, in a meeting, eventually evolved into like the big concept of the Styleframes.
Yeah, I'd love to. I really love the design of the dinosaurs. Avi, like, you know, actually, since you've taken Sarah Beth's class, this is one of the things that I learned. You know, I learn so much every time we make a class because I get to see the whole process. And so I've like absorbed a lot that way. And from Sarah Beth, one of the things I remember was her talking about this idea, I think she called it shape language, where, you know, pointy shapes make you feel a certain way, curved shapes make you feel a certain way. It never occurred to me until I heard her say that. And I'm curious, you know, like how much of that did you come into Ordinary Folk with? Because, you know, looking at these designs, they're simple, but there's like the curves are in the right spots to make them cute where they should be cute. They're not scary, but then there is a little bit of pointiness to them, and sort of balancing that when you're designing characters can be really tricky. So I'm curious, you know, like how much of that process for you was, I know how to approach this versus I'm just going to try stuff and I'll know it when it's done.
Yeah, I think a lot of trying stuff. I love those like kind of shape relationships, like even how like things like two half circles will like attract each other visually. And I think there's a book called The Art of Perception. It's like this really old, but it's amazing for like breaking down those different shape relationships and like why they make you feel a certain way or why like visually they behave a specific way. Because brains just add in a lot of things that aren't there in abstraction. And I think it's like one of the things that makes abstract storytelling so fascinating is that as humans, we just like fill in pieces. And so, yeah, I think these little like dinosaurs were just experiments in that, in seeing like how we can make them like really fun and cute, in like a variety of different ways. Yeah.
You're getting me thinking a lot about abstraction. I mean, I think the only design note we ever had was about these ice sculptures. And initially, I don't think you had these little reflections on it. And our art director, Frank, who has loved every single thing he's seen, he's like, the only thing I could say is that some of these don't totally feel like ice if you didn't know that this was an ice sculpture. And I threw that out, and it was like, okay, you literally put two little shapes on it. And that's it. Now it's ice. Now it's shiny. And, you know, it's just an example of like, sometimes it literally is one diagonal line. And now that tells you that is a shiny thing. And it's kind of insane when you think about it, you know?
Yeah, totally.
All right, let's talk about animation a little bit. So in the end, our students are actually going to animate these boards, and I can't, as of this recording, no one's done it yet. So I can't wait to see like what this ends up coming out like. I think it's going to be amazing. So Jorge, why don't, we take a hypothetical here? Like if somebody, well, first let's talk about just in general, like what in your opinion makes someone a good After Effects 2D animator? I know there's all kinds of different animators you work with, and some are After Effects, but they also do cell, or some are 3D focused. But we're talking about like people who are good at this kind of thing. What do you look for in work from someone who's animating something like this in After Effects?
Yes.
Yes is the correct. Yes.
Correct. I think in many ways it can be tied up to what we were talking about design earlier. I think there might be two kinds of animators that would look for something like this. There might be the kind of animator that jumps in halfway through the project and we just need someone who's very skilled, who can take direction very well, knows the software well, and can finish a shot because we've already defined the look of all the other remaining, 5 shots. And in that case, maybe what we're looking for there is maybe someone a bit more technically oriented that can, get direction well and can really make it shine the way it should be. So I think like there's a place for a lot of those people that are very skilled, and we work with those people quite a bit. But there's also like maybe the more fundamental animation that maybe it's a bit harder to find, where we are trying to define what these things are going to move like. And generally, we try to do that in-house because we kind of know each other. We know people's tastes. We know we can try a lot of stuff. We can experiment. We can do, quick motion tests and so on to define the look. And that's kind of what I generally look for, say, for someone who's going to be more full-time. Someone that can have that taste, what it would be in design, but for animation, where they can look at something and think of different ways to animate, where they can look at this and try a new thing or be willing to try a whole new software to develop a new way of moving things, as well as obviously having a big attention to detail to how things move and how things transition. And I think like specifically, like what does that look like? It's really hard to find. Like I find it's quite difficult. Sometimes it's easier to find the taste of a designer by their work than it is by an animator. Because with an animator, you don't know exactly how much they did, how much was the direction given. There's a lot of like more unknowns. Like I feel like designers, you can kind of get a sense that they are directed certain things, and you can get a sense of their taste. It's hard to know how much in an animation that someone did was their own ideas, their own direction, their own transition ideas, and so on. So it's a bit tricky when it says like, what are you looking for? Because it's kind of like I'm looking for all these various things, but I don't know if I can see the right of ways when I'm looking at people's work. So a lot of the times it's really just trying people out and seeing how they work and seeing how like I might know like, okay, I can see your reel, I can see your work, your keyframes are smooth, you got cool transitions, awesome. Like that's the base level. Mm-hmm. Like you need to know how to move things smoothly and properly. And then once we start working, then we get into like more of like what I'm saying, the fundamentals. It was like, I was talking to Greg about one of the questions that you sent, and he said something very good, which was like, well, what are the main things that are going to move? Like find the main element that your eye is going to follow, make that move properly, define the movements of that, and then you start adding things that complement that main movement instead of just jumping in and animating everything at once. So that's one of those things that, how do you know that? By looking at someone's reel, right? Like, how do you know how they animate, how they approach these things?
Yeah.
But that's something that I definitely look for in someone that can like see the big picture or like understand, but also like bring their own ideas that's a big thing. Like we just had a meeting just before this where we going through a storyboard and we talked with everyone involved in the project to kind of like make sure that we're all on the same page with the transitions that we came up with in the storyboard phase, but also so people can start bringing in their own ideas and or like maybe this section doesn't have to be this transition. Like bring your own ideas, try a few things. And so they're going to spend the rest of the week just trying a few things, kind of mocking it up to see what kind of transitions can work. So someone who's willing and ready to kind of bring their own ideas as well is super important. And I think like another thing is we want also someone who's willing to be able to step back. One thing that Avi just said, which is having her boards next to her as she's designing a single frame. I wish there was a way to do that when you're doing animation. Like, because it's easy to kind of scale back and see all the style frames and make the missing style frame. You kind of can see it right away. With animation, it's a bit more tricky to do that. You can't just have all animations playing on your second screen as you're animating. A lot of the times, because you can't just zoom out and see everything, you kind of need to rely pretty heavily on whoever's leading the animation or whoever's creative directing. And I guess that the same is for design, but it becomes a little bit more obvious in animation because someone might be super focused on this new idea, this new transition, and it's super crazy, and the chainsaw becomes 3D, and then it flips, and then it explodes into the lines, and then it becomes into the person. And I was like, this is awesome. You used all your skills. You brought in 3D. This is amazing. It's just not right for the design or the direction of this project.
Yeah.
Right. And being able to like step back and see, oh, yeah, you're right. I was so excited about this rig that I built that I need to use it because I spent 3 days building this rig. And I was like, well, actually, you don't need to use it. Like, it's okay to let it go and realize that you learn something from it to discover what's the right solution for it. Sometimes I feel like it's hard to let go of things that you work very hard at when you spend all these days because you feel like you wasted what you've done. But it's actually a good thing to realize, and maybe you would have only realized that by doing that thing. So it's not a waste. And then you just got to be willing to kind of like move on. And like we go through that in pretty much every project where like one of us gets super excited about this transition and does all these things, and we're like, you know what? It might be better to just do a pan,
just cut, yeah,
or a cut.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, and then like once you see it, it was like, yeah, this works better.
Right.
So I think like that's another thing that you also look for to someone who's willing to kind of like redirect as needed to make it a cohesive thing, because like we're pretty animation oriented in many ways as a studio just by the virtue of having more animators and designers. And a big thing for us is that the video needs to feel like maybe someone that doesn't really know can say that it was animated by one person. Like that's the goal. I don't know if we ever achieve that, but like I think like that level of cohesion when it comes to animation, we seek the same for design. And I think like the only way to do that is by willing to like compromise, move things, and adjust things. But anyway, that was a very rambling answer, but hopefully.
Well, I took notes. Okay, I want to dig in on a few things. So let me see if the way I'm interpreting this. And this is kind of like the way I guess I think about it. I'm curious. I just want to have you respond to this. So when I think about After Effects animators, I guess before I heard your answer just now, I would have put the skills into sort of two buckets. There's like the technical skills, which can be pretty important, right? So like if you look at the design of this chainsaw, there's a problem to figure out here of how the teeth of the chainsaw are gonna rotate around and look correct, right? Like there's gonna be some little trick to make that work. So someone who really knows After Effects needs to figure that out. That's the skill. That's the technical part. Then there's the animation part. And that's really what this class focuses on is, there's sort of some basic animation principles that you just have to know. You have to know about anticipation and overshoot and follow through and squash and stretch and all those things. You need to know how they work. But then there's like these overarching things. And that's kind of what it sounded like Greg was talking about. And the terms that I've always heard is eye trace, like making sure that your eye's in the right spot and controlling that very carefully, reinforcing the direction of things, right? So whatever the hero is doing, maybe the background texture is also doing that, kind of helping lead your eye. And there's a lot of these sort of overarching choreography things like that. But now there's this third thing that I think you were talking about, which is like, how should the thing move? Never mind like, yeah, we know there's probably going to be an anticipation, and we know there's probably going to be a little bit of a, an overlapping something. But it's almost like, what's your taste? Right? I guess to bring it back, like you got to have some good taste about what the heck is this chainsaw even doing, right? Like, and you have to come up with the idea. Maybe when it starts, it like sputters for a minute and shakes. Well, someone has to think of that. Is that the hardest part to find, do you think?
I don't know if it's the hardest, but it's definitely hard. And, and then it's not something that once you have it, you have it. It's like every project, all of us, every week we have meetings, and I don't think there's ever a meeting in which someone is not stuck. And that's just kind of part of it. And that's okay. And I think that's one of the advantages maybe of having an in-house, team, where being stuck is okay and encouraged sometimes, because it might help you to come up with the right solution. Whereas a freelancer being stuck for 5 days might not look great.
The meter's running.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it is a kind of like a different expectation in some ways. So I think giving room to try things and finding out how things should move is something that we try to do. And I was gonna say something about also like one thing that we also look for, and more maybe a bit of in between the skills and tastes, is if you have a good idea like of how it should move, like you should find whatever way to do it and not be limited by whatever software you're using. Like even like I can see a lot of students seeing this chainsaw and deciding, okay, I want this yellow squares to always be rotating, just like a chainsaw, right? So I'm just gonna do a dotted stroke and get it to just trim in and out, right? You might make that work, but it's not actually gonna be perfect. And in some ways, when I saw the design, I was like, I'm looking for the person who will actually animate it pretty much manually. And like, I'm giving tips out here. Like the way I would do it.
Keep going. Yeah.
Like the way I would do it, I would just actually animate one. So it rotates exactly in the right angle where I want it to rotate. Yeah. And the shadow goal is perfect, right? And I would just have it do 360 degrees, offset that. And then I have this big time remap that is always going to be perfect. It's always going to look exactly the way it should be according to the design, no matter where in the slide I am, right? Like that's how I would do it. But I can see others, I was like, oh, it's tapered, like stroke, offset, and then it's gonna look weird,
right?
Like, and it's gonna look like it was like just like a quick solution. Like we're both doing the same thing, but one is like kind of like trying to obey the design, and finding the best solution for the design rather than finding the easiest file solution in After Effects. So, anyway, I don't know how I got there, but I feel like finding like someone who's just willing to find the right movement for the right design instead of just catering the design to what After Effects can do is something that we definitely look for.
When I interviewed you for the Manifesto Hold Frame workshop that we did, one of the things that you really harped on was how much insane extra effort you put in and that you expect your animators to put in to maintain the fidelity of the boards. Like things that are ridiculous that like probably nobody except you will notice. Like I remember there was some example where you had, I think, a cube and there was a texture that needed to be on one side of it. And there was really no way to do it other than to every frame corner pin this thing and move a mat, and just because otherwise it wouldn't look exactly like the boards. And you had this respect for the design that I think it's kind of like, I just haven't seen that like, in many people. Like you will thrash yourself to make it look like, so the thing you just described I think is a perfect example of that, and I love that you picked that example, because a lot of the things, even in boards like this, I mean, and I'll zoom in so everyone can see this, it's deceptively simple. It looks simple, but if you look, this black triangle is not the same as this black triangle, and that's exactly what Jorge's talking about. If you just did the trim path and animated the offset, you'll get the squares moving mostly correctly. But I don't know, maybe it looks a little more interesting if they're bunched up at one end or something, or how are they going to appear right here at the base of it? That's good. There's something has to happen there too. And those are all the little things I assume you're talking about, Jorge. It's like those little details. You can tell when someone didn't just take the easy way out, right? Yeah. That's awesome. Avi, I want your take on this too. So, and this is the last question, and I'll throw it to you one more time, Jorge, because I kind of want to ask you this one more time, because that was such an amazing answer. Avi, I want your take on this too. So, you did these boards, And I'm sure in your mind, you have an idea of how things are moving, right? But in the end, it's going to be up to the students that end up doing this, right? And the original version of Animation Bootcamp has, I think, something like 16,000 artists have taken it, right? It's a lot. And all of them will have access to these boards now. So they'll be able to go back and do this again if they want to. But every new student, this is what they're going to be doing. And I'm curious, when you start seeing these out in the wild, what are you going to look for that you hope students do with your boards when you see them animated?
I mean, I think more than anything, I just hope it's like a fun like opportunity for people to practice things that they haven't done before. And sometimes that isn't always perfect, and I think that's okay. So I think
so yes, that's such a nice answer. That's what I was going to do.
I don't know.
You're so unselfish. Like,
I wanted to do it, and like I think okay, maybe like just the spirit of like the designs and like the fun and like the boldness is reflected in animation, and that matches. I think that would be really cool to see.
That's awesome. And Jorge, I guess I'll leave the last question to you then. You know, you as an animator looking at these boards and, you know, the stuff that sort of like kickstarted your infamy in our industry, a lot of it was like the way you animated simple shapes, right? So this is like early Jorge's bread and butter right here. When you look at these boards, what are the things that in your mind you see happening and you'd love to see students try and take on that challenge? You mentioned the chainsaw. Is there anything else?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm a cynical old studio owner now.
You really are, man. 4 kids, geez.
Yeah. You know, it doesn't matter if you have fun.
Yeah, right.
No, I think I think the main thing I would look for is, or what I expect is, it's always a little bit what we were talking about, catering the animation to the style. Like, I think a lot of the times, which is a very common, understandable mistake with students, is to just kind of like throwing all your knowledge into what you're doing, and not catering what is right for the style. Like I mentioned, like the chainsaw, like if it's all of a sudden goes 3D and explodes, like if it's done in a way that actually fits, I will be super happy to see it. But if it's just done because it's cool and you wanted to try it, in the sense of being a student, I think it's great. In the sense of the final piece, is that, like I need to see it from 2 different eyes, basically, like the animator eye and this guy's a student, like a student critique eye, if that makes sense. So I'm just gonna focus on the animation side, and I think like just seeing, like wanting to see animation that just feels like in some places maybe even blocky or snappy, or like moments where like it's just like very like it just rests and all of a sudden there's a big movement, because that's kind of what the style is asking for. That's probably what I would love to see. And it's like some like the motion that really fits the design, and that sometimes might be less motion that you think it needs. And that was kind of like the goal a little bit for this. It's like we're not putting things that are just crazy complicated, so that you go in a huge tangent, but like what's in front of you, how can you make this move in a way that fits the story, that fits the overall design? And maybe those movements can be pretty snappy and short and simple. Like I don't think everything, like I think projects like this one, there are many movements that you can literally get away with linear keyframes, right? Like it's not like, oh, you need to make every single keyframe ultra smooth, because there's a certain boldness and angularity to this piece that maybe the motion can use some of that as well, and not all everything is super butter smooth. So I think that's what I'm kind of excited to see how students respond to that.
I want to thank Jorge and Avi for coming on and for sharing their secrets. If you like watching interviews and breakdowns like this one, make sure that you absolutely murder that subscribe button so that you get notified when we drop awesome videos like this one. Check out Animation Bootcamp and our full motion design curriculum, link in the description, and I'll see you next time.